Hello and welcome to Mostly Vintage Cameras. This is a Minox 35EL. It's not actually the camera I wanted to talk with you about today, but I just wanted to give a little bit of background onto the Minox 35mm camera range. The EL was the first 35mm Minox, launched in 1974 at the Photographic show in Germany, and went on to sell something in the region of 370,000 units, just a little bit over in actual fact. And understandably, you have to remember this is from the 1970s, is absolutely tiny. To give you some idea, that is a standard AA battery in comparison. As you can see, very compact camera. People really like this thing, partly because of the size, but partly because of the features it offers. Some things which became commonplace on Minox cameras were the extending lens turret, the fold up lens cover, and people especially liked the fact it was a manual focus camera using this little dial here, and had aperture priority. I don't know if you can see the aperture ring there, we go. Being the 1970s, there was no such thing as DX coding, so you could even use the ISO dial as a kind of exposure compensation. So, good little camera. Needless to say, when it came time to update the EL, it was a case of rinse and repeat. The EL became the GL, and in time the GL became the GT. I don't have a GL, but that's a GT. As you can see, you have to look pretty close to spot the difference. One little thing with 35mm Minox cameras, the shutter release button colour tells you what model it is, if you happen to know the secret. Now, in about some point in the 1980s, Minox moved over to this slightly more, let's say, streamlined version, which has a more square-ended side, a push button on the lens release. Oh, there we go. This particular one is called a Touring. It's actually a limited edition, but is in fact a just an MB in a fancy colour and some fancy graphics. So let's pop these guys to one side. So we still have all the hallmarks you would expect from a Minox: manual focus, aperture priority. Some models later on also came with program exposure, but always in addition to the aperture priority. And in the mid-1980s, I worked for a dealer that certainly sold a lot of Minox cameras, and people often referred to it as a visual notebook. They liked the fact that if they had an SLR camera and a few lenses and a big system, they could have a camera that gave them the impression of some manual control, but they could carry around with them day to day. Also, the lenses were particularly good quality. So there you go, the most popular Minox 35mm cameras, sold over 600,000 pieces, which is pretty successful by more or less any measure. So Minox had the winning formula. They knew how to make very popular 35mm cameras, and they carried on doing this up until the early 2000s. Something of a surprise then, when in 1988 Minox introduced this guy. This is, as you can see, the Minox 35 AF, and it is, as the name suggests, an autofocus Minox camera. Not just autofocus, but also auto exposure. Still has manual wind on. A few things you'll notice: no fold down lens flap, no extending lens turret, no hot shoe. Very curious. It does keep some of, if I just go back to that MB, or Touring, it does keep some of the look and feel of the, let's call them the classic 35mm Minox cameras, and yet it is quite noticeably a little bit larger. This MB and all this Touring incidentally is fitted with a data pack, which does stick out a little bit. So let's take a closer look at this strange, some might say oddly duckling of the family. And let's start as ever with the batteries. Now this is where some of the idiosyncrasies of this camera start to show. I've set this battery cover slightly open because I must have changed the batteries in it a dozen times, and every time I've had to resort to using the small blade on my trusty Swiss Army knife. It is a very fiddly battery cover, even by Minox standards. The camera runs on two DL third end batteries. These are perfectly common camera batteries. A lot of Nikon 35mm SLRs of this age use these. However, they generally only used one. These are 3 volts each, which means this camera is running on 6 volts. And it's hard to see what a manual wind camera with no built-in flash unit would need 6 volts to use. But anyway, they just fit in the bottom there. And let's take a closer look at some of the controls. So we'll start on the front here, because this, to be honest, is where all the interesting stuff is. Plain size, got a CDS meter. You'll notice there's no lens cap or lens cover, no folding flap. There is actually no lens cap with this camera. Minox point out it's fitted with a permanent UV filter, which they say protects the lens. What they don't tell us is what protects the UV filter. That's a bit weird. We've got a standard viewfinder behind this plastic protective screen, 2 autofocus windows, which is fairly standard fare for an autofocus compact. As I say, this came out in 1988. What is a bit weird is that for a premium autofocus compact camera of the 1980s, it only has 4 focus zones. Now Minox are very good at this sort of thing. They are very knowledgeable, to say the least, about how to maximize depth of field and the properties of the lenses on their cameras. So it's no surprise that they went for a simplified autofocus system with just the 4 zones, but frankly it's not good enough. It's for a camera that cost, as best as I can tell, and it's a little unclear, £200 or perhaps a pinch over, and that's without the flash unit. You would really expect more than that. The other thing you'll notice, and this plays into the focus zone issue, is that whereas on our classic Minoxes we've got a 35mm f2.8, this is a colour Minotaur because it's a later version. The other ones were just Minotaurs, but they're all 35mm 2.8. The AF has a 32mm f3.5, and that again is just to squeeze, I suspect, a little bit more depth of field from that lens. The on-off switch is just here. It's going through a loading cycle there. Here the autofocus moving the lens in place there. The on-off switch is a strange little thing. It's almost as if they designed the whole camera and then at some point after the shape and style had been decided upon, they said there's no lens cover to turn the camera on and off, and they just thought, well, we'll bung a switch on the side there, that's fine. Little red dot tells you when it's on, that gets covered up to show you it's off. If you leave the camera turned on, it will auto power off after 10 minutes, so that was quite a nice feature. As you can see, this camera has DX film coding, and we'll talk about that when we open up the camera in a few moments. One gets the impression this camera, Minox went all out to make it as idiot proof as possible. They really didn't allow the photographer any opportunity to make the mistake or to use the camera when it shouldn't be used. And we'll look at how they did that and why that might not always be a good thing in a moment. So on the back, as you can see earlier, we've got manual film winding, single stroke on this camera, what I'm calling classic Minox's typically have a double stroke, so you wind it on twice. Film loading, there's this little catch on the side here. Doesn't really have the feel of a premium quality thing, but I mean, it works. And when we open up, it's a hinged back, fairly conventional. And again, referring back to our legacy Minox cameras, this is the GT. Film loading on this is very different. We've got a little catch there, and the whole back comes away to reveal the film chamber. And you'll see this has a fairly conventional slot for the film leader to go in, but our AF does not. It's a smooth take-up spool. So let's go ahead and pop a film in here. So film loading is actually very, very simple. Film goes in the film chamber. You know it's going to go wrong when you say something simple. Just lays onto the take-up spool, close the back, and it will wind on until it stops. And we can see the frame counter now starts to count up. Once again, as with most 35mm cameras, if you take up the tension in the rewind crank, this is a very fiddly little camera, isn't it? Then as you wind on, you'll see the rewind crank spin around, just giving you confirmation that the film is advancing correctly. On the top plate, frame counter, model number, shutter release button. There is a self timer, gives you 10 seconds to run around the front. It doesn't self cancel, so when you press the button, away it goes, and 10 seconds later it takes the picture. But if you don't turn it off, then the next time you go to take a picture, nothing's happening. What's gone wrong? Oh, what was that? You need to remember to turn the timer off. There is a flash unit for this camera, and we'll revisit that self timer when we look at the flash unit. So that's the basic camera. Let's look at some of the specifications. Again, one is left with the impression this is intended to be as automated and as idiot proof as possible. So camera shake is one of the biggest things that spoils photographs. Not really possible on this because it has a maximum aperture of a 30th of a second. So that's good in that you can't get camera shake with a long shutter speed. It's less good in that you can't put it on a tripod and use a self timer for a longer exposure. It does have a tripod socket. Not entirely clear why it would need one with a 30th of a second exposure. Top shutter speed is 500th, aperture is 3.5 to 11. Now I said we look at the DX coding, so let's take the film out. That again is very conventional. Push the rewind release button in, extend the rewind crank, and rewind. If I appear to be making a bit of a meal of this, it's because I'm doing this from behind a tripod and I've got a camera in the way. Wouldn't normally be quite so difficult. So as we can see, we have not a full suite of DX coding pins, which means we can't use just any old film speed that happens to be DX coded. The film speed range is in fact limited from 100 ISO to, curiously, 640. That's especially curious because in 1988, of course, there were films like Kodak VR1000, so you just wouldn't be able to use that. So as much as this is intended to be, as I keep saying, idiot proof, it is possible to buy a roll of Ilford Pan F or Kodachrome 64 or VR1000 or later on Fujicolor 1600 and get the exposure wrong, because if you have a non-DX coded film or it doesn't recognize the coding, it defaults to 100 ASA. or in 1988 I suppose it would have been ISO at that time. So there we go, that's the Minox 35 GT, a curious little camera. Let's look at some photographs that we've taken with it, and that of course means breaking out the MVC light box. 1 second. So let's take a general overview of these negatives. So we can see pretty clearly, first thing we can see is that we have a full set of negatives. Every exposure seems to have worked, and that's terrific. There is a slight variance. You can see here there's a little narrow gap between negatives, and here there's a wider gap. So the film winding on this particular example, not 100% accurate, but good enough. So let's look at some specific images. So straight away, focus range on this camera, incidentally, although it has 4 zones, they say it focuses down to 0.7 of a metre, or 70 centimetres, and obviously up to infinity, which seems an incredible range to cover, even allowing for the depth of field, with a 4-zone focus system. And that was something I was quite keen to try out with these images. I'm just going to move this tripod slightly, if you'll bear with me a second. Okay, hopefully that's a slightly better view. So this first image, signpost about 3 meters away. As you can see, lovely exposure, nice and sharp, no complaints there at all. So if you're taking pictures of, say, a small family group or a couple 3, 4, 5 meters away, you're going to get some great images here. So that is frame 1, I believe. If we go to, well, it's frame 0. If you go to frame 1, again, very sharp, a surprising amount of depth of field for the relatively near focus. Slight hint of vignetting, but that might just be the lighting that was evident at the time. Let's jump forward now, further on in the film. I'm going to look at, if I can find it, frame 10, which is this one here. Not the most exciting picture in the world, none of these will be, unfortunately. But again, very good levels of detail, very good sharpness, very nice colour rendition. I have to say the colours on this camera are excellent, and not just owing to the quality of the film. I'm not even sure what film this is. It was Portra 160, so it is a pretty good film. So yeah, that's perfectly nice. There is a slight hint of flare just appearing in the top of the image, and if we skip forward a few frames to frame 16, here we go. This is a more general view, and now we can see the sort of the flare and the loss of definition in the distance there. Tails off quite badly. Still a good photograph. You'd be perfectly happy with it, I guess. But again, we have to look at this in the context of it being a premium camera from a premium brand. There are other premium cameras, there are other premium brands, and there's 2 ways to look at these cameras when we're looking at vintage cameras. It's the user experience when it was new, and you went into a store and you spent £200+ on your camera at a time when a Canon Sure Shot would have been about 130. You really expect to get something perhaps a little bit different or a little bit better. Then, of course, skipping forward to the modern day, is this a fun and interesting camera to use today? And we'll take a look at that in more detail a little bit later. We're obviously not going to be spending that kind of money on this camera in the modern age. So zipping forward to another frame here, a classic for the Mostly Vintage Cameras channel is our Rickroll of Interest. Again, super sharp, slight hint of flare. My theory about the flare that's appearing in some of these images, I'm just going to turn the light back on 1 second, is that, I don't know if you can see this at this angle, this UV lens or this UV filter, I'm wondering if there's light coming in at this sort of an angle you imagine light coming in from all directions, is not bouncing between the cowling and the UV filter and causing just a little bit of internal flare. Light's going off again. That's my guess. 26 and 27, both frames are good, both very obvious. I'm just going to skip forward to some flowers, I believe. A little bit of hedgerow action here. So as you can see, that claim for 0.7 meter close focus distance, this is 160 ISO film, and this was as the light was quite definitely fading one evening. In fact, it was just about to start raining a thunderstorm, and yet the 0.7 focus claim does seem to hold true. And then lastly, we're going to look, perhaps not lastly, penultimately, we're going to look at this signpost. I really wanted to test out that close focus claim, and one has to say, it's done the job beautifully. Lovely colours, lovely sharpness. On this and the next frame, we can start to see that as you get to the blurry bit in the background, the bokeh if you will, not the nicest bokeh in the world, but that's what you expect from a 35mm compact camera. And then we get to, let's go for this one of the lock. Again, super sharp. A little bit of flare again, which seems to be an issue with this camera. Just a hint, not too much. I'm not particularly concerned by it, but just pointing it out because it does seem to be there. But the sharpness in the point of focus is terrific. I tried to find out what the focus distances were. I'm assuming one is infinity, one is presumably 0.7 of a meter, or maybe a little beyond. Minox might have set it to 0.8 or 1 meter, and relying on the depth of field of that lens to cover it down to 0.7. But again, how you get from 0.7 of a meter to infinity in 4 steps, they've done it. We can see on the photographs they're all sharp at all distances, and yet using a depth of field calculator I couldn't figure out what those distances were, and they don't appear to be recorded anywhere. I even emailed Minox and asked them if they knew. Minox, modern Minox that do the sports optics and telescopes and binoculars, not exactly the same company as made these cameras in the 80s. They didn't have any records, unfortunately, but they were kind enough to reply and say, we're sorry, we can't help you with that inquiry. So full marks to modern Minox for taking the trouble to reply to some weird guy that sent them a random email one day. Okay, let's get rid of the negatives and the light panel. So one thing we haven't looked at, which I've mentioned a few times now, is the flash unit for this camera. As we say, there is no hot shoe. So let's get the kit box that the camera came in. Not sure if that's going to fit onto the frame. Let me just lift this up a little bit. So Minox packaging is always beautiful, always lovely. It is, as I say, a premium product. So if you open this up, we can see we've got, I'll try and hold this up a little bit. The box the camera came in, the instructions, the flash unit. So let's grab that. I'm also going to grab that there and this presentation case. Oh, there we go. So this is the presentation box it came in. Custom fitted for the camera and a set of batteries with the Minox Made in Germany logo. All very lovely. This camera, when it came to me, came with all the original paperwork as well, which is absolutely lovely. The instruction book, the warranty card, and a list of places where all the flash instruction book. There we go. Now, one thing about this I did notice, which I was rather pleased to see, was the stamp from the retailer. As you can see, it was bought 6th of September 1990. So this camera came out in '88. It only sold a little over 13,000 units. Remember our classic Minoxes, the EL sold 370 plus thousand. The more popular ones over 600,000. The 35 AF only managed a little over 13,000. And I think there are reasons for that. We can see here the name of the shop it came from, Rossiter's Pharmacies in Tiverton. And I was very pleased to see that because Rossiter's is a very long association with the town of Tiverton, which is in Devon. There was a druggist store in the Rossiter family in the mid-1800s, and they've obviously carried on the druggist pharmacist type of operation in that town all the way up until at least 1990. So it's nice to see that long-running connection between the one family of pharmacists and the one town. 1 Bampton Street now is a Greg's bakery or shop. Whether that's an improvement or not, I hate to say. A lot of pharmacists did sell and do sell photographic equipment because, of course, when photography started up in a commercial sense and became popular in the 1850s and 1870s, you needed not so much the camera equipment as the chemistry to make your own wet or dry plates, as the case may be, depending on when it was, and to develop those plates. So there has been a long association with pharmacy stores and photography, and clearly Rossiter's carried on that association well into the 1990s, I should say. And this might explain some of the issues with the relatively low sales numbers for this camera. Because remember our classic Minox? Very popular with photographers that want to have the manual focus, that want to have the aperture priority control over depth of field. Less popular is going to be a slightly chunkier camera that doesn't give them any control at all. So who would a camera like this appeal to? It's a premium brand, it's got a premium price tag. It takes perfectly good photographs, very good photographs in fact, notwithstanding a slight issue with light flare. I suspect, had Minox moved away from its traditional outlet like family pharmacies in small Devon towns and got a deal with some kind of duty-free shop at an airport, maybe even a global distribution deal, this might have been a far more popular camera than it is. You can imagine a sort of chap that has an office in London, New York and Rome or somewhere, dashing through the airport and wanting a completely automatic camera to document his travels, but having no real interest in photography and wanting something completely automatic. Perhaps had it had that sort of distribution rather than the traditional camera shops and pharmacies, it might have been a more successful product commercially. However, let's quickly look at the flash unit. The flash unit, as you can see, doesn't have a traditional hot shoe fitting. It's got these 3 very stiff steel pins and a little catch on the side here, and it clips in like this. Or more accurately, it doesn't clip in like that. Quite a faff. No controls on the back of the flash unit, completely blank. Again, the camera takes care of everything, which is no bad thing. But what a horrible fitting. I mentioned using a self-timer, so you're at the Christmas party. Hey, let's take a group picture. Yeah, I'll turn the self-timer on and I'll need the flash unit. Terrific. Oh, hang on, just get the flash unit on. Ah, dear, oh dear. I think in the history of flash connectors, this has to be one of the worst. There probably is a knack to doing this, but I haven't got it yet. So now you, no, it's not even correct now, is it? Golly gosh. There we go. So now you've got your self-timer on, you've got your flash unit on, you take your picture of the group, and then you want to just take regular pictures around the table of guests and visitors to your Christmas party. Well, guess what? I need to turn that self-timer off, don't I? I've got to put the flash unit back on. Oh my word. Yeah, the flash unit, a little bit like the on-off switch, does seem to be a bit of an afterthought. What to make of it all? The flash unit, curiously, as far as I can tell, was slightly more expensive than the camera, which is a bit weird. The camera was, according to the documents I've seen, in Germany when it came out, 420-ish Deutschmark, as the currency was in those days. The flash unit added something like 450 Deutschmark to the price. So we're talking about a £200 camera and pound sterling, that is, and maybe a £230 flash unit. So you're talking together £400-ish. It was available as a kit with both. You saw the box earlier. So quite an expensive camera. As I say, a Canon Sure Shot would have been about £130, and in 1988 I believe that would have been a Sure Shot Supreme, which is a terrific camera and has a built-in flash unit. Bit bigger, admittedly. So let's look at some alternative cameras. As vintage camera enthusiasts, we obviously like the unusual and the quirky, and this ticks all those boxes for all manner of reasons. If you were to go to a one film, there's a loading cycle again, one film, 1 day shoot with one of these, it's quite likely you would be the only person there with it. In 1988, well, let's go back even further. In 1982, Pentax had this guy. It is admittedly a little bit bigger, but not by much. And of course it does have, if I can remember how to turn it on, turn the camera on, turn the flash unit on. There we go, a built-in flash unit. So now we've got autofocus, manual film wind, built-in flash unit. This is a 2.8 lens, a 35 2.8 lens. Also focusing down, I've just noticed, a 0.7 of a metre. And this was also about £200, I believe, if memory serves. We've even got a little exposure compensation button, which is terrific. These are now getting quite sought after, in actual fact. So, given the choice between something like this in 1988, or this came out in 1982 in fact, or something like this, again, if you're a photographic enthusiast, you're probably going to go this way. If you're an executive traveller dashing through a duty-free shop, you might very well be tempted by the German-made premium brand Minox. But I think the 35AF in the modern times is a terrific camera. I really do like it. I'll be continuing to use it, and controversially, I'm going to suggest the 35AF Minox as an alternative to the very popular Olympus Trip. You go on that 1 day, 1 film shooting photography thing with the Trip, it's quite possible you'll be one of several people. This you might feel is a completely different beast. It's sort of manual focus, but again, not so far removed. The presets, there are only 4. People will point out there is a manual scale on the bottom and you can set it between the presets, but of course most people don't. Also, this is automatic exposure, like the 35AF, and again people might point out you can set the aperture manually, to which I would point out that's only for flash exposures. If you set the manual aperture in ambient lighting, you have no idea what your exposure is going to come out as, because the camera may choose the 40th of a second shutter speed, or it may choose the 200th of a second shutter speed. so there's quite a difference in shutter speed there. The other thing with the trip, they are super expensive these days. The prices trips are selling for are becoming ridiculous, quite frankly. And the film transport, the winding on and the film loading, whilst perfectly conventional, is a little, let's say, agricultural in comparison to the Minox. So if you're tempted by a trip and you wanted something a little bit more exclusive, or you wanted something a little bit smaller and lighter, this is very light, maybe go for the Minox. Anyway, that's been the Minox 35 AF. I hope somebody's found this video useful or interesting. Thank you for your time. I do appreciate it. Have a good day.